The candles at Ashworth Park numbered in the hundreds that Christmas Eve, and every one of them found Eleanor Hale before she was ready to be found. She stood at the far edge of the ballroom in a gown of pale gray silk that had been her mother's, taken in at the waist and let down at the hem, and still it did not quite reach the floor. Around her the women of the county glittered in velvet and seed pearls, their laughter catching the light the way their jewels did, easily, without effort. Eleanor held a glass of ratafia she had not tasted. Her gloves, mended twice at the left thumb, pressed against the stem. Across the room, near the marble hearth, where a portrait of the late Duchess of Ashworth watched the company with painted calm, Lady Pemberton leaned toward Miss Arabella Kingsley and said something behind the shield of her fan. Miss Kingsley's gaze traveled to Eleanor. Her mouth curved. The words were not audible across the distance, and they did not need to be. Eleanor had heard them before, in private, at breakfast, in the garden when the wind carried Lady Pemberton's voice through the open study window. The temporary Duchess. That was what they called her. Not to her face. Not quite. And never within the Duke's hearing. The Duke himself stood near the door to the East Gallery, one hand resting on the back of a chair he had not sat in. He was speaking to Mr. Fenton, the solicitor, and his posture carried the particular stillness Eleanor had learned to read across 3 months of shared hallways and avoided gazes. His jaw was set. His eyes, the color of slate after rain, moved once across the room and found her, and something shifted in his expression so briefly that if she had not been watching him, she would have missed it entirely. She looked away. She was always the first to look away. Above the mantelpiece, the portrait of the late Duchess held its painted composure, and beside it, half hidden by the holly garland the servants had hung that morning, a smaller frame held a landscape of Ashworth Park in summer. Somewhere inside that painted house, the real Duke of Ashworth was carrying a grief he had shown Eleanor exactly once, and the memory of it pressed against her chest, now like a hand she had not invited and could not remove. If you have ever stood in a room full of people who have already decided what you are, you know the particular weight of a hemline that does not quite reach the floor. Stay here. Stay close. This story has been waiting for you. 3 months earlier, in the last gray week of September, Eleanor Graves had been teaching music to the Caulfield girls in Hertfordshire when the letter arrived. It was addressed in a hand she did not recognize and sealed with wax the color of claret. Mr. Fenton, solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Ashworth, wrote with a proposition so strange that Eleanor read it twice at the kitchen table, while the kettle cooled beside her. The late Duke's will contained a provision. His elder son, Lord Philip Hale, had died 2 years prior in a riding accident, leaving a daughter, Charlotte, now 8 years old. Guardianship of the child had passed to Marcus Hale, the younger brother, who had inherited both the title and the estate upon his father's death 6 months later. The will stipulated that the new duke must be married by the 31st of December, or guardianship would transfer to a cousin in Norfolk, a man Marcus had described to Mr. Fenton, in language the solicitor declined to reproduce in writing, as unfit. The Duke required a wife. He did not require a marriage. What he proposed was a legal union, solemnized quietly, lasting 6 months. At its conclusion, Eleanor would receive an annuity of £150 per year, and the satisfaction of knowing that her late father's debts, which totaled £212 and sat on her mother's mantelpiece like a stone she could not lift, would be discharged in full. Eleanor's father, the Reverend Thomas Graves, had died the previous spring. He had been a good man and a careless one, a scholar who forgot to collect his tithes and gave away what little came in to families he judged needier than his own. He spent what remained on books he annotated in a hand so small Eleanor needed lamplight to read it. pressing his arguments into the margins of hymnals and volumes of sermons as if theology were a conversation that never ended, only paused between correspondence. He left behind a widow with a weak chest, a daughter with no dowry, and a leather-bound hymnal filled margin to margin with his thoughts on grace. Eleanor carried that hymnal in her trunk when she arrived at Ashworth Park on the 2nd of October. She had packed it beneath her second dress and above her mother's ivory hairpins, wrapped in a cloth she had cut from her father's only good shirt. The house rose from the Derbyshire landscape like something the hills had produced of their own accord, all pale stone and long windows and silence. The drive was a quarter-mile of gravel, bordered by elms whose leaves had just begun to turn, and the wheels of the hired carriage made a sound against the stones that Eleanor felt in her teeth. Mrs. Blythe, the housekeeper, met her at the servants' entrance and corrected herself with visible effort, redirecting Eleanor to the front hall. The hall was floored in pale marble and hung with portraits of hale men stretching back 2 centuries, each one darker-haired and more severe than the last. Eleanor counted 7 before she ran out of wall. The Duke was not present. He had left instructions for her rooms, her meals, and her access to the library, and the instructions were precise and impersonal in the way of a man who had thought carefully about comfort without thinking at all about warmth. Her chamber was on the 2nd floor, east-facing, with a window that overlooked the garden and a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. The bed was made with white linens. A jug of water sat on the washstand. Everything was correct. Nothing was kind. Lady Pemberton was present. She stood in the morning room with her back to the door and did not turn when Eleanor entered. She was a tall woman of 50, with excellent posture, and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who has managed a household for years and does not intend to stop. She was the late Duke's sister, unmarried by choice, installed at Ashworth Park since her brother's first marriage, and her position in the house rested on a foundation so long established that she had ceased to distinguish it from the house itself. She looked Eleanor over the way one examines a piece of furniture that has been delivered to the wrong address. "You are the vicar's daughter," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Eleanor said. "You will find," Lady Pemberton said, her gaze settling on Eleanor's mended glove, "that arrangements of this nature work best when everyone remembers what they are. The temporary Duchess need not trouble herself with the running of this household. I have managed it for 19 years. I will manage it still." She did not wait for a response. She turned back to the window, and her dismissal was as clean and as total as the closing of a ledger. The wedding took place on the 5th of October in the estate chapel with Mr. Fenton and Mrs. Blythe as witnesses. A clergyman from the neighboring parish read the service. The Duke placed a plain brass ring on Eleanor's finger. His hand was steady. His face revealed nothing. He said the words the clergyman required, and not one syllable more, and when the brief ceremony ended, he inclined his head to her, a gesture more like the close of a business meeting than the beginning of a life, and walked out through the vestry door. Eleanor stood in the chapel alone. The stained glass above the altar threw a column of green light across the stone floor, and outside a blackbird sang 3 notes and stopped. She looked down at the ring. It sat on her hand like a borrowed thing. It was a borrowed thing. She wore it. It weighed almost nothing. The first weeks at Ashworth were a study in negative space, in the shape left behind when a person is present in a house without being present in a home. Eleanor ate breakfast alone. She walked the grounds alone. Through the walled kitchen garden, where the last of the autumn roses held their color against the coming frost. Along the lake path, where the willows trailed their yellowing leaves into the water. Past the stable block, where the Duke's horse, a tall bay gelding, stood watching her from behind the half door, with an expression of mild assessment. She read in the library alone, though the library was the finest room she had ever entered, a long room with windows on two sides and shelves that rose to the ceiling, and a particular quality of silence that felt less like absence and more like company. She took her father's hymnal to the window seat each morning and read his annotations, his cramped marginal notes arguing with the theology of the hymns he loved. And for a few minutes each day, the distance between Ashworth Park and the small vicarage in Hertfordshire collapsed to nothing. Charlotte found her there on the 9th of October. The child appeared in the doorway of the library with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to enter rooms without being noticed. She was small for 8, with dark hair cut unevenly and a way of holding her hands behind her back that made her look like a miniature solicitor. She did not speak. She stood at the edge of the carpet and watched Eleanor read. "Would you like to sit down?" Eleanor asked. Charlotte sat. She chose the opposite end of the window seat, as far from Eleanor as the cushion allowed, and folded her hands in her lap. Her shoes were scuffed at the toe. Her dress was clean and pressed, and chosen by someone who knew what a child should wear, without knowing what a child might want to wear. "What are you reading?" Charlotte asked. "My father's book," Eleanor said. "He wrote notes in the margins." "What sort of notes?" "Arguments, mostly. He disagreed with a great many hymns." Something happened in Charlotte's face. It was not a smile. It was the place where a smile might eventually live, if the ground were made safe for it. She came back the next morning, and the morning after. By the third week, Eleanor was reading aloud from the hymnal's annotations, while Charlotte pressed autumn leaves between sheets of blotting paper at the desk. And the library had become, without announcement, theirs. Charlotte's favorites were the leaves from the copper beech near the lake. Broad and dark and veined like maps of countries she could not name. She arranged them by size on the blotting paper and examined each one with a seriousness that made Eleanor's chest ache, because it was the seriousness of a child who has learned that the world takes things away and has decided to preserve what she can. On the last day of October, Charlotte brought Eleanor a leaf she had pressed herself, a small, perfect oval from the elm by the chapel, and placed it on the window seat without a word. Eleanor did not speak either. She set the leaf inside the hymnal, between the pages where her father had written about mercy, and Charlotte watched her do it with an expression that was, finally, unmistakably, a smile. The Duke found them in the library on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. Eleanor did not hear him enter. She was seated at the piano in the far corner, playing a passage from Handel that her father had loved. And Charlotte was beside her on the bench, her small hand resting on the edge of the keys with an expression of such concentrated attention that Eleanor had forgotten anyone else existed in the house. She finished the passage and looked up. He was standing in the doorway. His coat was still damp from the ride, and his hair was disordered from the wind, and he was looking at Charlotte with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face before. It was not tenderness, exactly. It was the careful, controlled edge of tenderness in a man who did not trust it. Charlotte had not spoken to him voluntarily in 6 months. Mrs. Blythe had told Eleanor this in the quiet, factual way of a woman who has watched a household grieve badly. The child ate alone. She did not come to the drawing room after supper. She had not laughed, Mrs. Blythe said, pressing her hands together as if the fact hurt them, since her father died. And now she sat at the piano beside Eleanor, and her hand rested on the keys as if music were a country she had not known she was permitted to enter. The Duke said nothing. He stood in the doorway for a count of 5, and then he withdrew, and his footsteps retreated down the corridor with the measured pace of a man walking away from something he wanted to walk toward. "Come inside," the Duke said to Eleanor that evening as she crossed the gravel toward the garden in the thin November dusk. She had not realized he was behind her. His voice was level, clipped, a command delivered from a height that left no room for discussion. "It is too cold for a walk." "I am quite well, Your Grace." "You are not wearing a coat." He said it the way he said everything, as a matter of fact. She went inside. She did not know why his voice at her back had made her pulse knock once against her wrist, hard and unreasonable, and she did not examine it. The next morning, a wool mantle appeared on the chair outside her room. It was deep green, lined in silk, and it fit her as if it had been made for her measurements, which, she realized with a heat that spread from her throat to her collarbone, it almost certainly had been. There was no note. There was never a note. The following week, Lady Pemberton held a small dinner for the county families. Miss Arabella Kingsley arrived in a gown of winter blue velvet with pearls at her throat and a smile that consumed the room. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful in the period, with the full confidence of a person whose value has never been questioned by anyone whose opinion she respected. She had been, Eleanor understood from Mrs. Blythe's careful account, the woman Lady Pemberton had chosen for the Duke long before the will's deadline had forced a different calculation. The woman the Duke had been meant to marry. Miss Kingsley moved through the drawing room the way water moves through a channel it has cut for itself, naturally, without resistance. She knew the names of every servant. She knew which chair the Duke preferred. She placed her hand on the arm of Lady Pemberton's settee, with the easy, possessive gesture of a woman who considered herself already installed. She spoke to Eleanor once during the evening. In the drawing room after dinner, in front of 5 other women who held their glasses and watched. "You must find Ashworth terribly grand," she said. "After a vicarage." Her voice carried no malice. It did not need to. The hierarchy did its own work, and Miss Kingsley was the hierarchy's fluent speaker. "The library is very fine," Eleanor said. "Oh, yes," Miss Kingsley said, and turned to Lady Pemberton with a smile that closed Eleanor out as cleanly as a shut door. "The temporary Duchess reads." The room heard it. The room absorbed it. 2 women near the fire exchanged a glance that confirmed the phrase had been circulating before this evening, that it had traveled from Lady Pemberton's morning room through the parish visiting circuit, and arrived at this dinner already worn smooth with use. Eleanor's hand found the back of the nearest chair, and she held on until her knuckles steadied. Across the room, the Duke set down his glass. He did not look at Eleanor. He looked at Miss Kingsley. And his expression did not change. And his silence in that moment was louder than anything he could have said. He turned to the door. "Walk with me," he said to Eleanor as he passed her chair. He did not look back. She followed him into the corridor, and they walked the length of the East Gallery without speaking. Past 6 generations of Hale portraits and a window that showed the November dark pressing against the glass. At the gallery's end, he stopped. "You do not have to stay for the remainder of the evening," he said. His voice was low. "They are not here for you." "They are not here for you either, Your Grace." Something moved in his face. She could not name it. He turned and walked back toward the drawing room, and she stood in the gallery with the cold coming through the window glass, and her pulse beating in her wrists, and the green mantle wrapped around her shoulders like an answer to a question she had not asked. November brought frost and the slow, grudging disclosure of a man who had not intended to be known. Eleanor learned him in increments, the way one learns a house by living in it, noticing which doors stuck and which floors creaked, and where the light fell at particular hours. She learned that he rode every morning regardless of weather and returned with his jaw set against whatever the ride had not cured. She learned that he checked on Charlotte at night, standing in the doorway of the nursery for a count of 10 before withdrawing, and that he never entered the room. She learned that he kept the study door open when Eleanor played the piano in the library, and that when she stopped playing, the door closed within a minute. She learned that his hands were always still, except when he spoke of his brother, Philip, at which point his right hand moved to his breast pocket and rested there over the shape of something small and hard. On the 1st of December, Eleanor found the miniature. She had gone to the study to return a book, and the room was empty. The small oval portrait sat on the desk beside a stack of correspondence, face up, unguarded. A woman's face looked out from it, fine-boned and fair, with light eyes and an expression of such composed certainty that Eleanor felt, for a disorienting moment, as if the woman were the real occupant of the house, and Eleanor, the ghost. Her name was Catherine. Eleanor turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashworth, his face was not composed. Something had cracked along the surface, a fracture so fine she might have imagined it, if his voice had not confirmed it. "She was my wife." He crossed to the desk and picked up the miniature. His thumb settled over the painted face with the practiced ease of a gesture performed 1,000 times. "She died in the 3rd year of our marriage, a fever that came in the October before last. It moved quickly. The physician sent word, and I was in London." He stopped, his gaze fixed on the window, on the bare December garden beyond it, on the frost that traced the edges of the glass. "The roads were bad. I arrived a day after the end." He spoke the last phrase the way a man walks across ice, carefully, as if too much weight in any word might send him through. He placed the miniature in the drawer. His hand lingered on the handle. "I had not intended you to see that," he said. "Forgive me, Your Grace." "There is nothing to forgive. You returned a book." He looked at her then, and the crack in his composure had not closed. She saw in it a grief so practiced it had become architecture, a structure the man had built around himself so completely that he no longer distinguished it from his own walls. He had married Catherine for love. He had lost her to a fever he could not outrun. And now he stood in a study in Derbyshire with a woman he had married for a clause in his father's will, and the distance between the two marriages was the distance between a man who had once trusted the world and a man who would not make that mistake again. Eleanor left the study without looking back. She walked to the library and sat in the window seat and opened her father's hymnal and pressed her hand flat against the page where Thomas Graves had written, in the margin beside a line about steadfast love, a single word: enough. If you are still here, listening, perhaps you already know what Eleanor did not yet permit herself to name. That the crack in his composure was not a flaw. It was a door. The days before Christmas sharpened everything. The house filled with preparations Eleanor had no authority to direct, and no invitation to join. Lady Pemberton managed the arrangements with military precision, consulting no one except Mrs. Blythe, and even Mrs. Blythe deferred with a stiffness that suggested the consultation was a formality. Holly was cut and hung. Silver was polished. Menus were drawn up in Lady Pemberton's angular hand and posted in the kitchen, and Eleanor's name appeared nowhere on them. Not as a consulted party, and not as a listed guest, as if the Christmas Eve gathering were a production, and Eleanor merely someone who happened to be standing in the wings. Miss Kingsley arrived 3 days before Christmas Eve to assist, her trunk carried in by the same footman who had carried Eleanor's 3 months earlier, and her presence in the house was a statement so plain it required no translation. She sat at Lady Pemberton's right hand at dinner. She arranged the garlands in the ballroom. She selected the music for the evening and chose 3 pieces Eleanor recognized and 1 she did not. And when Eleanor offered to help with the table arrangements, Miss Kingsley looked at her with a sympathy so perfectly calibrated it functioned as dismissal. "You need not worry about the arrangements," Miss Kingsley said. "I am sure you have other concerns." Charlotte, who had begun to speak in full sentences at meals, and who had, on the previous Tuesday, laughed aloud at a passage Eleanor read from the hymnal's margins, a high, clear sound that had stopped Mrs. Blythe in the corridor and brought her hand to her mouth, was informed by Lady Pemberton that she would dine in the nursery on Christmas Eve, as children did. "Eat something," the Duke said to Eleanor at breakfast on the 23rd of December, his eyes on her plate, which she had not touched. "I am not hungry, Your Grace." "You have not eaten since yesterday." She looked up. His gaze was on the window, not on her, as if the observation had cost him nothing. His right hand rested on the table, 3 inches from her own, and she was aware of those 3 inches with a specificity that had nothing to do with measurement, and everything to do with the heat in her wrist, and the stillness of his fingers, and the snow beginning to fall beyond the glass. She picked up her fork. That evening Lady Pemberton struck. She did it in the drawing room, with Miss Kingsley present, and Mrs. Blythe just outside the door, and the fire throwing its light across the carpet in long orange bands. She waited until Eleanor was seated, until the tea had been poured, until the door was closed. "I have written to my nephew's solicitor," Lady Pemberton said. She was standing by the mantelpiece, and her posture was that of a woman delivering a verdict she had rehearsed. "The terms of your arrangement are clear. A marriage of convenience, entered for the purposes of the will, lasting 6 months, after which you will leave this house with your annuity and your father's debts cleared, and the Duke will be free to marry as he ought to have married from the beginning." She looked at Miss Kingsley. The look was a coronation. "I intend to announce the arrangement's true nature at the gathering tomorrow evening," Lady Pemberton said, "so that the county may understand that no lasting claim has been made. The temporary Duchess will be recognized for what she is, and the household may proceed as it should have proceeded from the start." Eleanor's hands were in her lap. Her father's hymnal was upstairs on the window seat where she had left it that morning, and she thought of his marginal note on the hymn about grace, the one that read simply, "Unearned, and still it comes." She thought of Charlotte's pressed leaf tucked between those pages. She thought of the green mantle on the hook by the library door. "You may announce what you wish, Lady Pemberton," Eleanor said. Her voice did not shake. She had expected this. She had expected it since the moment she arrived at the servants' entrance and was redirected to the front hall by a housekeeper who could not quite meet her eyes. "I entered this marriage on the terms that were offered. I have honored every one of them. I have not presumed upon your nephew's name or his household or his patience. I have read to his niece and played his piano and walked his garden in a coat he gave me without being asked. And I have done so knowing that every day here was borrowed." She paused. Her breath came thin and steady. "The ring on my hand means I gave my word. It means nothing else, and it has never meant less." She stood. She did not excuse herself. She walked out of the drawing room and up the stairs and into her chamber, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and pressed her hands together until the shaking stopped. The brass ring caught the last of the corridor light through the open door. It sat on her finger, plain and warm from her skin, and she did not take it off. Christmas Eve arrived with snow. It came softly, without wind, the kind of snow that settled on the sills and the hedges and the gravel drive as if it meant to stay. And by late afternoon, Ashworth Park wore a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear her own breathing in the upstairs corridor. She dressed in the gray silk. She pinned her hair with the 2 ivory pins her mother had given her before she left Hertfordshire, and she descended the staircase with her shoulders straight and her chin raised and her hands steady at her sides. The ballroom had been lit with every candle the household possessed. The county had already assembled, 40 guests in their Christmas finery, the women in velvet and the men in black, the room warm with firelight and conversation and the particular anticipation of a gathering that knows something is about to happen. Lady Pemberton stood at the center of the room in a gown of deep garnet, her authority over the evening as visible as the diamonds at her throat. Miss Kingsley stood beside her, winter blue velvet catching the light. The guests parted for Eleanor the way water parts for a stone, politely, briefly, without warmth. She heard the phrase before she saw the speaker, a woman she did not know, standing near the punch table with a glass in her hand, speaking to the wife of the local magistrate. "The temporary duchess," the woman said, her voice carrying the cadence of someone repeating a phrase she had been given, rather than a phrase she had coined. "I am told she is to leave by Epiphany." 3 separate voices now. 3 separate rooms. The same reduction. Eleanor's chest tightened. She found a place near the windows where the candles were fewer, and the cold came through the glass in a thin, steady current. And she stood there with her hands clasped and her chin raised, and her gaze fixed on the snow beyond the window, falling in the dark like something patient and unrushed. She would not cry. She had agreed to this. She had entered this house with open eyes and a clear contract, and no expectation beyond the terms she had been promised, and the terms had been honored, and the debts would be paid, and her mother would be safe, would be, if there had been moments when the terms had felt insufficient, when the Duke's stillness in a doorway, or his voice at her back in the cold, or the weight of a green wool mantle appearing without explanation, had made her want something the contract did not contain. Those moments were her own errors, not his. She had agreed to be temporary. She had not agreed to be ashamed of it, and she was not. The ballroom doors opened. The Duke of Ashworth entered the room, and the room changed. He wore black, as he always did, and his cravat was tied with the severe precision of a man who treated formality as a discipline rather than a pleasure. His gaze swept the room once. It passed over Lady Pemberton, over Miss Kingsley in her winter blue velvet, over Mr. Fenton standing near the hearth with a glass he was holding too tightly, over the assembled families of the county in their Christmas finery. It found Eleanor. She was standing by the window, alone, in a gown that did not reach the floor, with her chin raised and her hands clasped, and the plain brass ring catching the candlelight on her left hand. He looked at her, and he did not look away. The room registered it. A silence opened in the center of the crowd, the way ice opens on a river. Slowly, from a single point, spreading outward until it reached every edge. Lady Pemberton stepped forward. Her mouth opened, the shape of the announcement she had rehearsed already forming on her lips. The Duke crossed the ballroom. He did not hurry. He walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to arrive at it breathless. 3 strides past the hearth. 4 past the knot of county wives who drew back to let him through. 5 past Lady Pemberton, whose announcement died on her lips as he passed without stopping, without glancing, without granting her the authority she had held in this house for 19 years. He stopped in front of Eleanor. The snow pressed silently against the window behind her. The candles held steady. The room held its breath. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She heard it land in the silence like a key turning in a lock, a sound so small and so precise that it rearranged every room it opened, his hand extended, palm up, in the gesture of a man not asking a woman to dance, not offering a courtesy, offering himself. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. The crack she had seen in the study, the fracture in the composure he wore like armor, had widened, and through it she could see the whole of him. The grief and the guardedness and the terrible, careful wanting of a man who had lost one wife to a fever. He could not outrun and had spent 2 years building walls against the possibility that he might ever be too late again. He was not too late. "Eleanor is my wife," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words carried the way a bell carries across snow, clear and undeniable, and every person in that ballroom heard them. "She has been my wife since October, and she will remain so." Mr. Fenton stepped forward from the hearth. His face held the particular expression of a solicitor who has been preparing a document and has finally been asked to present it. "The revised settlement was signed this morning, Your Grace," he said. "The original terms have been dissolved by mutual written consent. The marriage stands in perpetuity." Lady Pemberton's hand went to the diamonds at her throat. Her mouth opened and closed. For a moment, she held the shape of the announcement she had been prepared to deliver, the public exposure she had planned as carefully as the seating chart and the menus and the garlands on the walls. The announcement did not come. She looked at the room, and the room was looking at the Duke, and the Duke was looking at Eleanor, and the architecture of Lady Pemberton's authority, the structure she had maintained for 19 years with precision and confidence, and the absolute certainty that she knew what this house required, shifted beneath her feet, like a floor that had always been sound, and was suddenly, quietly, not. Her hand dropped from the diamonds. Her posture, that magnificent posture, contracted by a single degree. She did not speak. Miss Kingsley's hand found the back of the nearest chair. She did not speak either. Her face held a recognition Eleanor had not expected. Not anger. Not humiliation. Something closer to the expression of a woman who has been reading a map and has realized, all at once, that she has been holding it upside down. Charlotte appeared in the doorway. She was wearing a white nightgown, and her feet were bare on the cold marble, and she had clearly come down from the nursery by the back stairs, drawn by the silence that was louder than any noise the house had made in months, and she stood at the edge of the ballroom with her small hands clasped behind her back, and her dark hair falling across her forehead, and her eyes on Eleanor. The Duke's hand was still extended. Eleanor took it. His fingers closed around hers, steady, warm, and the brass ring on her left hand pressed between their palms. And she felt the weight of it for the first time, not as obligation, not as contract, not as a borrowed thing that would be returned by epiphany, as a promise that had meant everything all along. Only she had not been permitted to believe it. The ballroom exhaled. Somewhere near the hearth, a woman began to clap softly, the way one applauds in a church, and the sound spread through the room like warmth through cold hands, quiet, collective, and real. Christmas morning came with the fire still burning in the library grate, and the snow still falling beyond the windows Eleanor had claimed as her own. She sat in the window seat with her father's hymnal open on her lap, the leather cover soft from years of handling, and Thomas Graves's cramped handwriting looked up at her from the margins of the hymn she had read to Charlotte the week before, the one about light in winter. Charlotte was asleep on the settee with a blanket pulled to her chin and a pressed leaf. the small, perfect oval from the elm by the chapel, clutched loosely in her hand. The green wool mantle hung on the hook by the library door, beside his riding coat, as if it had always belonged there. The Duke sat in the chair beside the fire. He was not reading. He was not writing. He was watching Eleanor in the window seat with an expression she no longer needed to translate, and the miniature of Catherine was not in his pocket. Eleanor had seen him place it in the drawer of his study desk the evening before, gently, with the care of a man setting down something he had carried for a long time, and close the drawer, and leave the room without looking back. Snow pressed against the glass. Charlotte stirred, and the pressed leaf crinkled in her small fist, and the fire shifted in the grate, sending a brief constellation of sparks upward into the dark of the chimney. Eleanor turned the page of her father's hymnal and found, in the margin beside the line about steadfast love, the single word in his careful hand. Enough. She closed the book. She held it against her chest. Across the room, in the chair by the fire, the Duke of Ashworth looked at his wife, and for the first time in the 3 months she had known him, she did not look away. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's story. If her journey moved you, leave a quiet word below, and come back soon. There are more windows to claim, and more fires still burning.